much. Thank you all for coming this evening. I feel a little bit like the odd person out here talking about energy with two folks here are going to be doing some really high-tech approaches to energy. I'm going to obviously approach my talk from the perspective of agriculture. And do I just do my moving this forward? Do I advancing? Do I just? Oh, we're here. There we go. The wrong thing there. There we go. All right. Thank you. So I really would like to talk about agriculture's role in mitigating climate change, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The agricultural sector, most folks think of agriculture as obviously food production, but it has been overlooked as a source of greenhouse gas emissions and potentially one of the greatest tools we have for mitigating climate change. The UN and recently folks have gotten together, countries, and recognized that missing at the table was agriculture and most of the talks relating to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And I'll talk about why that is in just a second. But it's important to agriculture because climate change is both a cause and an effect. I'll get into the causes in just a little bit, but in recent times we've been looking at agriculture as being a little bit of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. We've realized that with respect to a lot of our commodities, maple sugaring, honey, that already farmers are beginning to feel the impact of climate change, and I think it's just probably a harbinger of things to come. I put up on the screen here the one book, Times of Feast, Times of Famine, and over the course of history, agriculture really has been sort of the bellwether and been the signal for realizing that things are changing with regard to climate. A lot of it had to do with the fact that it impacted wine, grapes and wine, so people kept a close eye and make sure that things weren't changing too rapidly. But it is positioned. We are positioned in a particularly interesting intersection between food and climate. And agriculture is a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, accounts for 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions, or 25% of agriculture-driven deforestation as well. So probably one of those little lesser-known facts that this is an impact and something that we should be aware of. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Massachusetts, how could we possibly, talking about this scale and this type of agricultural impact, what impact or effect could we have in maybe having some changing this course? I'll talk about that in just a little bit. This is just kind of another way of looking at the nitrous oxide emissions by source, and you can see agriculture is a major emitter. Now this is not all bad news, it just happens to be a fact, and much of this is related to, as you can probably well imagine, industrialized agriculture, not the kind that we practice so much in Massachusetts, and that's probably why I'm pretty optimistic that we have an opportunity to be a leader in pointing in a direction that can show how agriculture can be a positive force with respect to climate change. Climate-friendly agricultural practices that I'll be talking about a little bit include increasing the carbon content of the soil. That's related to sustainable agriculture and some biochar and what a lot of us are talking about in terms of remineralization. Some of these things may seem a little far out to you. It was pointed out earlier, I started at a place called the New Alchemy Institute back in the 80s, and we did a lot of things back in the 80s that people thought were really pretty far out. We were talking about, certainly organic agriculture. We were talking integrating agriculture, aquaculture within a solar envelope, and recycling the wastewater from fish tanks through hydroponically supported cucumber, lettuce, and tomato plants. So we actually had folks like the National Aeronautics and Space Administration come and watching this bunch of hippies doing this stuff inside this thing we call the Cape Cod Ark. It turns out those were the fundamentals of what we now call sustainable agriculture. So if we talk about some of these things, I want to talk about how we are beginning to try to integrate these into our mainstream here in Massachusetts, and maybe only in Massachusetts. Of course, it's only in Massachusetts that a black guy from Cleveland, Ohio, working at the New Alchemy Institute could become commissioner. I put this quote up here, and this is it's called Soils and Men. I don't intend for you to read everything, but it's just sort of an interesting quote. The earth is mother of us all, plants, animals, and men, phosphorus and calcium of the earth build our skeletons and nervous systems. Nature treats earth kindly, man treats her harshly. Obviously, this is a bit of a condemnation on agriculture. We know that we can, what can be done, we're beginning to do it. We don't have much time. Any idea who may have said this? And some of you may have heard me before, but I'll buy you lunch or dinner. Tell me, who might it be? Who's that? Thoreau, yep.
Wendell Berry.
Wendell Berry, great. Yeah, somebody said Bill McKibben, somebody else said Bucky Fuller. Actually, it's Henry A. Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, probably the greatest Secretary of Agriculture this country has ever known, and he was the author of this, the 1938 Yearbook of Agriculture. Probably the best volume, about 800 to 1,000 pages, on sustainable agriculture, focusing on the soils. And again, sort of today you see a lot of talk, we talk about agriculture and how we're going to improve the quality and the quantity of our agricultural system. It's with GMOs, it's genetically modified organisms, and it's genetically manipulating the plant. What Wallace focused on, and what I think you're going to find a lot of young farmers, and what we're talking about in progressive agriculture today, focusing on the soils. And not manipulating it, but doing exactly what we did when I was at the New Alchemy Institute, using nature as a model and a guide. And if not exactly mimicking nature, understanding that nature has, for 4 billion years, pretty much got her act together and knows how to develop and sustain a system. 4 billion years of sustainability, not 4 billion years of growth, but of development, rearranging the parts, adapting. So we want to take that model. And that was in 1938. Unfortunately, something happened around 1976 that changed the course of agriculture. We had a secretary called Earl Butz, and his approach was get big or get out, and urged farmers to plant commodity crops like corn and soybeans from fence row to fence row. By the way, commodity crops, you talk about agriculture, soybeans, corn, wheat. In Massachusetts, we don't grow, from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's perspective, we don't grow commodity crops. You know what we grow?
Food.
We grow food, but absolutely right. But how does the U.S. Department of Agriculture characterize what we grow? We grow what are called specialty crops. But that's spinach, that's lettuce, that's kale, that's apples. But they're called specialty crops. And when people complain or comment upon sort of subsidies and who gets support and is this really not, so most part specialty crops don't qualify for that. So we're a different type of agriculture. I just want to, but the type of agriculture that Earl Butz promoted, basically he was proud of the fact that we went from a nation where 60, 70, 80% of the people supplied the food for the nation to around 4%. But as we replaced the people and the farmers, we replaced them with what? Machines, energy, and fertilizers. The energy had to come from somewhere. So we took people off the farm, and that was a conscious policy, off the farm so that farmers could work in factories, and that we would replace them with a different type of energy. The other thing that happened is we got centralized. We pulled, and again, to the point where, like we talk about the great breadbasket of the U.S., of course, we do know that a lot of the agriculture supported today could not exist if it weren't for the water subsidies and weren't for the fact that the Colorado River almost dry, well, it does dry up. It dries up before it hits the Gulf because of the tremendous demands of water, on water from that type of agriculture. Today, it's been estimated the average distance of food travels from farm to your dinner plate is 1,500 miles. I don't know exactly where that number comes from. We've been using it for a long time. Slate magazine recently said they thought it came from a study that was done in 2001, and I know that's not the case because we were saying that back in the 80s, 1970s and 80s, and actually somebody called me on that at one point and asked me if I could give them a citation for where this 1,500 miles came from, and I didn't know really what to say, and I told him I think it was part of a CIA report that was done to look at the vulnerability of our lines of supply. And then, of course, there's no way you could trace that, so they took that and believed and said that was it. But this is basically true. 1,500 miles is the average distance. So what can we do? We talk about the tipping the scale back to something that makes sense, that's less energy dependent, and maybe can be a sort of a source of energy. We talk about sustainable agricultural practices, and that's manure management, bionutrient strategies, shortening the distance, again, shortening the distance between supply and consumers, and then really shortening that supply. We'll talk about this, and we'll take about urban agriculture. We've all got to assume some responsibility for growing our food, and there is an incredibly important movement going on with regard to urban agriculture. We're blessed here because we do have a governor who really believes this. This is from the Edible Berkshires magazine, where Deval Patrick is called the agricultural governor. I work for the Department of Agricultural Resources within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. That's the EOEEA. Now, we have a number of priorities within that large agency. It oversees the Department of Energy Resources, DPU, Food and Agriculture, a number of other agencies. But one of the major ones is address hunger and eliminate food deserts by increasing the access to fruit, fresh, nutritious, locally grown foods. That's our mandate. DOER has another mandate, 2,000 megawatts of electricity generated from renewable energy sources. There's a greenhouse gas emissions goal to reduce to decrease between 10 to 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions down to the levels 1990 levels by 2020. And the Department of Environmental Protection wants to eliminate the disposal of commercial food waste in landfills by 2014. Now, these are all important goals. They all impact, and they're energy related, and they all impact agriculture. And you can see that the goal is to kind of say, can we do all these together? Can they coexist? Can we meet these goals without unduly sort of stressing or penalizing another? And I'm going to do it from my perspective because I believe there is some pressure on the part of agriculture in meeting some of these goals. Climate change mitigation, again, reducing food miles, reducing fertilizer use, recycling wastewater, enhancing rainwater infiltration, reducing urban heat islands. That's where the urban agriculture is going to come in, enhancing carbon sequestration, and providing better diets, all part of what we want to do. Now, one of the most obvious ways that agriculture contributes to mitigating climate change is serving as sites for renewable energy projects. And we know that, again, wind projects, particularly in maybe upstate New York, when you get out to the Midwest, there are megawatt scale wind projects on farms, and it's proving to be pretty successful. They take up a fairly small footprint. They don't necessarily conflict with either vegetable growing or cattle growing. We don't really have that overlay, that sort of confluence in Massachusetts with a good wind regime and our dairy, our farms, whether they're vegetable or dairy. So it's a bit of a, it's part of an option for us, but it's not a major option, but we're still doing our part. And this report, or this was published in 2013, that shows that since 2007, over 100 farms have worked with the Department of Agricultural Resources to put 156 energy efficiency and renewable energy projects in the ground, and that saved almost $1 million of energy costs each year and reduced CO2 emissions by almost 11,000 tons annually. So we're doing what we can. We have programs that really do encourage farmers. We provide resources to encourage them to enhance their energy efficiency and to generate as much electricity as they can, because obviously it contributes to the viability of farms. What we're trying to deal with here and grappling with is a little bit of the battle and the tension between integrating renewable energy into your farm or merely being a host. And in some cases, the temptation to convert or maybe transform yourself from a farm to a utility or a waste facility, because the dollars are clearly there. The temptation is there to do more and more composting, to do more and more anaerobic digestion, to do install more solar panels, can really be a temptation that we would hope that we can sort of restrain. In some cases, we do think that some of the solar developers are actually perhaps preying on some of our farms, tempting them to install solar panels. Why would they want farms? Because they know who the owners are, the land is flat and it's well drained, and many of the farms are under something called an agricultural preservation restriction. So the state has purchased its development rights, so a developer knows that land will never be developed, so they can put the solar panels without fear that it'll be competed with. We don't want to get into a battle of renewables energy versus agriculture. So we're trying to figure out and working with our colleagues in the various agencies to make sure that we can strike that balance between the two. By the way, I just want to point out that in the lower left-hand corner there, that's the Jordan farm where work with anaerobic digestion is really proven to be something very promising. It's become a source of manure management. We're generating electricity and developing a soil amendment, all by combining commercial food waste with the manure from dairy farms, and it's proven to be a win-win-win situation. We would love to see more and more of those happen. Small-scale wind is also pretty successful, and solar, again, our goal is to make sure that at least 51% of the electricity generated from renewable projects on farms is being used on the farm, and trying to, again, without sort of getting too far down the road and jeopardizing the farm operation. The buy local initiatives, they're throughout the state now. When I was commissioner 20 years ago, we were struggling to get folks to think about Massachusetts growing the fresher, to buy locally. It was kind of a tough sell. 20 years later, now here I come as a return engagement, and the demand for locally grown food has never been greater. And so we're trying, and again, that's a good sign. It means we're shortening that distance between farm and consumer. Granted, right now we probably are capable of producing or meeting we probably provide about 15% of the food needs here in Massachusetts. Farmers are getting better and better at meeting demands for the most widely popular vegetables, and they're doing that. So that's been, that percentage of the vegetables and fruits that are in greatest demand are increasing, but we are a small state. And the question is, how much can we actually produce? Probably on a regional basis, there's been some calculations, back of the envelope calculations, that as a region that is New England, not Northeast New England, we could conceivably meet 50 to 60% of our food needs regionally, but that would require about 5 million acres of land being in production, so that might mean some loss of forest land and some other things. Again, just the back of the envelope, but right now we are very diverse in what we produce. Most people are very surprised, not only at our diversity in terms of what we produce, but in some cases where we rank nationally as in terms of, again, not a surprise with cranberries, but wild blueberries second in the nation, squash 9th, maple syrup 9th. So there is, we are a much more productive and attractive agricultural state than most people assume. We're also expanding marketing options so that we can enhance the opportunities for farmers to sell. What makes a difference in Massachusetts, as opposed to some other states, is that many farmers in Massachusetts are relying more and more on selling directly to consumers and less on going through the wholesale market. So they get a bigger share of that dollar than before, than if they sold wholesale. But here's the part I want to finish with, and that is, again, talked about the other things of hosting or integrating renewables onto the farm. But the whole notion of focusing on soils and enhancing the productivity and the quality of the soils, and as a result, the quality of food that's produced, but also the capacity for the soils to actually sequester greenhouse gas emissions. And part of that is being done with compost, and that's particularly important as we talk about urban agriculture. Composting is becoming ever more important than it ever has before in terms of a soil amendment. We're talking about anaerobic digesters, as I mentioned before, as a way of managing waste, but also producing very valuable fertilizer, and again, preventing these materials from having to enter into the landfill. Remineralization, it's a mouthful, but it's basically, once again, sort of mimicking natural processes. We know that we focus a lot of time, organic agriculture, restoring organic material to the soil, and we understand how important that is. But there's also the important trace minerals that don't get replaced organically and actually get replaced only mechanically through processes like glaciation. But the lack of those trace minerals can have an incredible impact on the quality of soils. And there are now efforts to restore through powdered rock and others to try to maintain that balance between, again, sort of the organic and inorganic soil amendments. The biochar movement can, right now, again, a lot of discussion back and forth, but there's clearly a great deal of interest and optimism about the ability of biochar, which is a solid material that comes from carbonized biomass. You basically, again, sort of burn your organic material absent oxygen. You basically come up with a charcoal. And you add that to your soil that has a number of beneficial properties, and it resists degradation. It creates it's a soil enhancer. It can really again hold carbon and stable over a long period of time. Jury is still out. There's right now just begun. Universities and research institutions have taken a look at this very seriously, to look at this as a possibility of being a major source of carbon sequestration. Where did this come from? Many of you, I don't know if your book was published maybe a decade ago, called 1491. They looked at the Amazon. They looked at that and realized that the Western Hemisphere was vastly more populous and sophisticated than what we thought before Columbus arrived. And as a matter of fact, what was happening, that the indigenous folks there were using this material called terra preta, that was actually supporting many more people. At least that's than was suspected before, and which has led to the speculation that many parts of the Amazonia are actually human-made, actually manufactured. So it starts to change what we think about in terms of a natural or natural system, protected system. The pre-Columbian Amazonians believed to have used biochar to enhance soil. They produced it by smoldering agricultural ways and pits and trenches, and created this terra preta. So we're talking about a little bit, the New Alchemy Institute and others. There are lessons to be learned from the past, and we're trying to see if we can bring those into the 21st century to help us address to do a couple of things. Again, enhance our ability to grow food, but in the process, increase the opportunity or the capacity for soils to retain greenhouse gases. It's just a sort of a diagram of what the cycle of biochar, and on the right-hand side there is a comparison of soils, one without and one with biochar. You can, again, that's all you have there is color, but University of Massachusetts, a number of universities working on this with a great deal of promise. I won't belabor that, it's almost time is up, but I do want to just sort of end on this notion of urban agriculture. As we talk about providing and increasing access to fresh, nutritious food, shortening the distance between the farmer and consumers, again, the 3,000 miles that we depend upon really sort of rely upon for most of our food, means that we've got tractor trailers going across the country to provide us with our food needs. Most of those trucks are carrying with the equivalent of sort of empty calories. You can't take, most of you, how many of you here you're probably your gardeners, backyard gardeners, have grown your own vegetables, you've grown your own tomatoes, and you know what a fresh tomato should do if you drop it on your kitchen floor. It really should splat, and it should not bounce. When you take a tomato, though, that has to make a trip 3,000 miles across country, and you're going to put them, stack them in tractor trailers, and stack them one crate on top of the other, you have to breed toughness in. And when you breed toughness and endurance in, there's only so much room, genetic room in that tomato. You're going to breed taste and quality out. And that's basically what's happened in terms of the food that we're consuming as a result of that has become less nutritious. Now, so we're trying to shorten that distance. Last Saturday at the Roxbury Community College, we held our first annual conference on urban agriculture. We had 350 people attend. We had a waiting list of about 180. And these are serious folks who are talking about not just backyard gardening and not community gardening, but actually farming within the city. The City of Boston, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, just has issued a draft Article 89. It's a zoning ordinance that will enable commercial agriculture within the City of Boston. Now, some of this is land-based, and it means doing things like raised beds, because we do know that most of the soils there all the soils have to be considered contaminated. They have to be considered brownfield, unless we do some of the things I talked about earlier, that is composting, biochar, and start to build them up. But people are still making that effort. But there's another source of growing area that is right now, for the most part, uncontested to a large extent, and that's the rooftops. And so we've got probably acres of roof space that can be used for both rooftop farms. Higher Ground is a group that's actually in the final stages of planning and building a rooftop farm on top of the Boston Design Center on the seaport, or rooftop greenhouses. Now there's a farm, theirs is open air, because the capital cost of greenhouses, again, is a little bit beyond what they can afford, but there are companies like Lufa out of Montreal that are interested in building tens of thousands of square feet of rooftop greenhouses, because of one, the market for fresh greens, among other things, is really pretty incredible in Boston. But two, they see this as a way of starting to meet the food needs of folks living in the city. This is the Fens. It's possible. I mean, again, if we start talking about reducing the urban heat islands, this is right within the city of Boston. It's a very promising and very doable goal. So we see agriculture as being a critical part of the problem with regard to climate change. We see agriculture is having the potential for all sorts of reasons, because it's not just a single thing. We're talking about not just addressing the energy part of the equation, but also the food, nutrition, the community building part. As we put that together, it becomes increasingly attractive. That includes forest, permaculture, trees are a critical part of this. I don't know, most of you folks, if you live in Boston, but we have public orchards throughout the city of Boston that were funded by a program that was funded by the Massachusetts legislature at the prompting of Mel King back in the 1970s, called the Fruition Program. So these are sort of unseen and unknown gems. Lastly, let me end with the fact that we have a new generation of farmers. A lot of the things I've been talking about are a little foreign to some of our more traditional farmers, although some of them are adapting some of these strategies. But there's no question that folks like Derek Christensen up in the upper right-hand corner, he's doing a lot of work with the soils. We've got the Urban Farming Institute down in the lower left-hand corner, and there are young people who understand that there's a promising future in agriculture, especially as we look at these sustainable strategies that are, again, a far cry from what Earl Butz had envisioned back in 1976. Thank you.